Do not count on me when you are old. My wife and kids come first. Those were the words my son sent me on a Wednesday morning at exactly 9:14. I know the time because I stared at the message so long that the numbers became burned into my memory. Some people think heartbreak arrives with shouting, slammed doors, and dramatic goodbyes. Mine arrived through a text message while I was standing in line at a pharmacy waiting to pick up blood pressure medication. I read the words once, then again, then a third time. Around me, people continued moving through their day. A cashier laughed at something a customer said. A baby cried near the entrance. Someone dropped a bottle of vitamins. Life carried on exactly as it always had. Yet something inside me became very still. My name is Eleanor Brooks. I am 71 years old, a widow, and the mother of a man named Jason. For most of my life, I believed there was nothing stronger than the bond between a parent and child. Even when children grow up, move away, and build families of their own, part of you assumes that connection remains. Perhaps it changes shape, but it remains. At least, that is what I thought before I read that message. When I reached my car, I sat behind the steering wheel and looked at the screen again. There was no argument leading up to it. No disagreement. No misunderstanding. 2 days earlier, I had simply asked whether he and his family wanted to come over for dinner the following weekend. He never answered. Then this arrived. Do not count on me when you are old. My wife and kids come first. The sentence that hurt most was not the first half. It was the second, because I never asked him to choose. I never expected him to love his wife less. I never wanted his children to come second. Yet somehow, in Jason's mind, caring about his mother had become a threat to caring about his family. I drove home in silence. The grocery bag sat untouched in the back seat. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had already made a decision. I would not argue. I would not send a long emotional response. I would not remind him of the years I spent raising him alone after his father died. I would not list sacrifices. I would not beg. I carried the groceries inside and placed them on the kitchen counter. Then I sat down at the dining room table and opened the message one final time. My finger hovered over the keyboard. After several seconds, I locked the screen and set the phone aside. That was my response. Silence. Later that afternoon, I drove to my doctor's office for a routine appointment. During check-in, the receptionist handed me several forms to update. Emergency contacts, medical preferences, family information, ordinary paperwork, the kind most people complete without thinking. I stared at the section labeled emergency contact. Jason's name sat there. His phone number, his address, information I had not updated in years. For a long moment, I simply looked at it. Then I crossed out his name. The movement felt strangely calm, almost peaceful. I replaced it with the name of my closest friend, Judith. A woman who called every week. A woman who showed up when she said she would. A woman who never reminded me I was a burden. When I handed the forms back, nobody noticed anything unusual. But I did. That evening, I returned home and made another change. Then another. I updated medical records, legal documents, community contacts. Everywhere Jason's name appeared as the person I was supposed to rely on, I quietly removed it. Not out of revenge. Out of acceptance. He had told me exactly where I stood in his life. The least I could do was believe him. As the sun disappeared behind the trees outside my kitchen window, I sat with a cup of tea and looked through an old photo album. There was Jason at age 6 holding a fishing pole twice his size. Jason at 12 grinning beside a science fair project. Jason at 23 on the day he graduated college. In every picture, I saw someone I would have done anything for. Someone I often did do everything for. Yet the man who sent that message felt like a stranger. Before going to bed, I checked my phone one last time. No apology. No follow-up explanation. Nothing. Just those words waiting silently on the screen. Most people would assume that was the worst part of the story. It was not. The worst part was realizing that the message did not surprise me as much as it should have. Because deep down, signs had been appearing for years. I had simply chosen not to see them. The next few days felt strangely quiet. Not because anything around me had changed, but because I had stopped chasing answers. For years, whenever Jason pulled away, I found reasons to close the distance. I called first. I apologized first. I adjusted my expectations first. This time, I did none of those things. Every morning I woke up, made coffee, and looked out at the small backyard my husband and I had spent decades caring for. The maple tree near the fence was beginning to change color. Autumn always arrived gently in our neighborhood. The leaves never seemed to rush. They simply let go when it was time. I found myself thinking about that more often than I expected. On the fourth day after the message, my friend Judith stopped by unexpectedly. She carried a container of homemade soup and the kind of expression that told me she already knew something was wrong. "You have been quiet lately," she said as we sat in my kitchen. I smiled politely. Maybe I finally ran out of things to say. Judith studied me carefully. She had known me for nearly 30 years. There was very little I could hide from her. Eventually, I handed her my phone and let her read the message. She read it once, then again. Finally, she placed the phone on the table and shook her head. "Eleanor." I raised a hand. "Please do not defend him." She sighed. "I was not going to." The answer surprised me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You deserve better than that." I looked down at our hands resting on the table. The simple gesture nearly brought tears to my eyes. Not because she was right, because kindness felt so unexpected after reading those words from my son. Later that evening, I opened an old photo album and found myself drifting through memories. There was Jason at age 8, holding a pumpkin larger than his head. Jason at 15 standing awkwardly in a suit before a school dance. Jason at 22 moving into his first apartment. Looking at those photographs, I noticed something I had never fully admitted before. Even years ago, I was always the one taking the pictures. I was behind the camera, behind the scenes, behind every success. That realization stayed with me. During the second week, more memories surfaced. Not dramatic moments. Small ones. Forgotten ones. The kind people usually dismiss. The Thanksgiving when Melissa changed dinner plans without telling me. The Christmas morning when Jason promised to stop by and never showed up. The birthday dinner where I learned about family decisions after everyone else already knew. Individually, each incident seemed harmless. Together, they formed a pattern. A pattern I had spent years pretending not to see. One afternoon, while sorting paperwork in my home office, I found an emergency information form from a community center I visited occasionally. Jason's name appeared under the section labeled Family Contact. I stared at it for several seconds. Then I picked up a pen and crossed it out. The action felt surprisingly calm. Not angry. Not dramatic. Simply practical. I replaced his name with Judith's. Afterward, I sat quietly at my desk looking at the updated form. Something shifted inside me. It was not revenge. It was acceptance. If Jason truly meant what he wrote, then my responsibility was to believe him. Not argue with him. Not convince him otherwise. Believe him. A few days later, I attended a community luncheon at the local church. I almost canceled that morning. Instead, I forced myself to go. During lunch, I met several women around my age who spent their time volunteering, traveling, and building lives that did not revolve entirely around their children. Listening to them talk, I realized how much of my identity had become tied to being available for Jason. Every decision, every holiday, every plan. Somewhere along the way, I stopped building a future for myself and started waiting for invitations that came less and less often. That night, I returned home feeling strangely lighter. For the first time since receiving the message, I did not check my phone before bed. I left it on the kitchen counter and walked past it without stopping. As I turned off the lights and prepared for sleep, I realized something important. Jason believed he was telling me not to count on him someday. What he did not understand was that his message had already taught me how. During the third week, something unexpected happened. I stopped feeling abandoned and started feeling awake. It is difficult to explain the difference unless you have lived through it. Abandonment leaves you staring at what is missing. Awareness forces you to look at what has been there all along. One rainy afternoon, I sat at my dining room table sorting old paperwork when I found a stack of birthday cards Jason had given me over the years. Most contained simple messages. "Thank you, Mom. Love you. Hope you have a great birthday." Ordinary words. Yet as I arranged them by date, I noticed a pattern. The messages became shorter every year. Less personal. Less thoughtful. Eventually, they were not handwritten at all. Just signatures beneath store-bought greetings. It seemed like such a small thing. But relationships rarely change all at once. They fade one small decision at a time. That realization stayed with me for days. Around the same time, I began volunteering twice a week at the community center. At first, I signed up simply to stay busy. Then I discovered something surprising. I enjoyed it. I helped organize events, greeted visitors, and assisted with programs for seniors. The work was simple, but it gave structure to my days. More importantly, it introduced me to people who never saw me as someone's mother. They saw me as Eleanor, a woman with opinions, experiences, and stories of her own. One afternoon, while helping set up chairs for an event, a retired teacher named Frank asked how long I had lived in town. We ended up talking for nearly an hour. Not once did the conversation revolve around children or grandchildren. Driving home afterward, I realized how rare that had become. For years, nearly every conversation I had centered around Jason, his schedule, his family, his needs. Somewhere along the way, I had allowed my own life to shrink around his. That evening, I opened my calendar and started planning things I had postponed for years. A weekend trip with friends, a gardening workshop, a historical tour in a neighboring state. Small things, yet each one felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Meanwhile, Jason remained silent. No calls, no messages, no attempts to explain the text. Strangely, his silence no longer dominated my thoughts. The space he left behind was slowly being filled by other things. Better things. Then, near the end of the month, I received a call from my granddaughter Hannah. Her voice immediately brightened my day. We spoke about school, friends, and college plans. Eventually, she grew quiet. "Grandma." "Yes, sweetheart. Can I ask you something?" I smiled. "Of course." She hesitated. "Are you mad at Dad?" The question caught me off guard. I looked out the window at the fading afternoon light. "No," I said honestly. "I am hurt, but I am not angry." Silence followed. Then Hannah spoke again. "He is different lately." My attention sharpened. "Different how?" "I do not know." She sounded uncertain, more stressed, more distracted. I listened carefully. "Has something happened?" Another pause. "Mom says everything is fine." The answer told me more than she realized. In my experience, people rarely insist everything is fine when everything is actually fine. Before we ended the call, Hannah said something that stayed with me long afterward. "Grandma, I miss how things used to be." After hanging up, I sat quietly in my living room. For a moment, I allowed myself to remember. Family dinners, holiday gatherings, random phone calls. The version of Jason who once stopped by just because he happened to be nearby. I missed those things too. But I also understood something I had not understood before. Missing the past does not mean you should sacrifice your future trying to recreate it. As the evening settled around my house, I looked at the updated emergency contact forms sitting neatly inside a folder on my desk. Weeks earlier, changing those documents felt like a loss. Now it felt like preparation. Not because I expected the worst, because I finally accepted reality. Jason had told me not to count on him. And for the first time in my life, I was learning how not to. As autumn deepened, I began noticing something I should have seen years earlier. Melissa was not openly cruel. In many ways, that made everything harder to recognize. She never insulted me directly. She never raised her voice. She never told Jason to stop speaking to me. Instead, she specialized in small adjustments. Tiny changes that seemed harmless on their own. A holiday dinner moved to a different date without mentioning it to me. A family outing planned after everyone else had already agreed. A birthday celebration that somehow slipped past my calendar. Each incident came wrapped in a reasonable explanation. Too many guests. Last-minute changes. Scheduling conflicts. Life happens. For years, I accepted every explanation because I wanted peace more than clarity. One afternoon, while organizing old family photographs for a community center project, I found myself looking through pictures from the previous decade. At first, I was searching for images to frame. Then I started noticing patterns. In older photographs, I stood beside Jason almost every time. Family vacations, school events, holiday dinners. I was there. Gradually, the distance changed. I appeared farther from the center. Then only in group photos. Then occasionally not at all. The shift happened so slowly that I never noticed while living through it. Seeing 10 years arranged across my dining room table made it impossible to ignore. Later that week, Judith came over for lunch. While we ate soup and sandwiches in my kitchen, I showed her some of the photographs. She studied them carefully before setting one aside. "Do you remember this Thanksgiving?" she asked. I looked down at the picture. Melissa stood beside Jason. The grandchildren sat at the center of the table. I was visible near the far end. "Of course," I said. "Why?" Judith hesitated. "Because you spent half that day cooking." I laughed softly. "That sounds like every Thanksgiving." She nodded. "Exactly." After she left, I thought about her comment for a long time. There is a difference between being included and being useful. For years, I convinced myself they were the same thing. I helped with meals. I babysat when schedules became difficult. I attended events when invited. Somewhere along the way, I stopped asking whether I was being valued or simply utilized. A few days later, Hannah called again. She sounded frustrated. "Dad and Mom argued last night," she said. My stomach tightened slightly. "About what?" "I am not completely sure." She paused. "But your name came up." I remained silent. "Mom said you were becoming more independent lately." The statement surprised me. Independent? Hannah laughed softly. That was her word. After we ended the call, I sat in my living room watching leaves fall outside the window. Independent. The more I thought about it, the more I realized why the word mattered. For years, my life revolved around availability. If Jason needed help, I adjusted. If Melissa needed a favor, I rearranged plans. If the family schedule changed, I adapted. Now I was building a life that did not depend on their approval or invitations. Perhaps that change felt unsettling to people who had grown accustomed to my constant accessibility. The following weekend, I attended a gardening workshop in a neighboring town. It was something I would have declined in the past because I always wanted to keep my weekends open for family. During the drive home, I realized no one had called. No one needed anything. The world had continued turning without my waiting by the phone. Surprisingly, that realization felt freeing rather than lonely. That evening, I updated another document. Then another. Emergency information. Insurance contacts. Community records. Every change was practical, quiet, unemotional. Yet each one represented a decision. I was no longer organizing my future around assumptions. I was organizing it around reality. As I placed the completed paperwork into a folder, my phone buzzed on the table. My heart no longer jumped the way it once had. I glanced at the screen calmly. The message was not from Jason. It was from Hannah. Only 6 words appeared on the screen. "Grandma, something is really wrong." I stared at the message for several seconds. Then another appeared. "Dad looks scared." For the first time in weeks, a feeling of concern moved through me. Because whatever distance existed between Jason and me, he was still my son. And something told me that the consequences of his choices were finally beginning to arrive. For the next several days, Hannah's message stayed in the back of my mind. "Dad looks scared." Those 4 words carried more weight than she probably realized. Fear changes people. It strips away confidence. It exposes weaknesses. And sometimes, it forces truths into the open that would otherwise remain hidden. I did not call Jason. I did not ask questions. If there was one lesson I had finally learned, it was that chasing answers rarely brings peace. Instead, I focused on the life I had spent months rebuilding. I attended community events, met friends for lunch, continued volunteering. On the surface, everything looked normal. Yet every now and then, I found myself glancing at my phone, wondering what was happening inside my son's house. The answer arrived unexpectedly on a Friday afternoon. I was helping organize donations at the community center when my phone buzzed. "Hannah." I stepped into the hallway and answered immediately. "Hi, sweetheart." Her voice sounded rushed. "Grandma, are you busy?" "No." "What is wrong?" Silence followed. Then she lowered her voice. "Dad lost a lot of money." I leaned against the wall. "What do you mean?" "I do not know all the details." She hesitated. "But there were investments." My stomach tightened. "Investments?" "Mom keeps saying they trusted the wrong people." I closed my eyes briefly. So that was it. Another piece of the puzzle. The stress. The fear. The late-night arguments. The growing distance. "How bad is it?" I asked gently. "Bad enough that everyone is scared." Her answer came quickly. Too quickly. Like someone repeating words she had overheard more than once. After we ended the call, I stood alone in the hallway for several minutes. Memories surfaced unexpectedly. Years earlier, after my husband died, I received several offers from people promising easy financial opportunities. Every one of them sounded appealing. Every one of them promised security. My husband had taught me a simple rule before he passed away. If something sounds too good to be true, slow down. Ask questions. Verify everything. That advice had protected me more than once. I wondered whether Jason had forgotten it, or whether nobody had ever asked him to slow down. That evening, Judith came over for dinner. As we sat at the kitchen table, she noticed I seemed distracted. "What happened?" she asked. I told her only the basics. Nothing specific. Just enough. She listened carefully. Then she said something that stayed with me. Sometimes people confuse independence with isolation. I looked up. What do you mean? Real independence means knowing when to ask for help. She stirred her tea thoughtfully. Isolation means refusing help until you have no other choice. The distinction felt painfully accurate. Over the following week, more small signs appeared. Nicole stopped posting cheerful family updates online. Hannah sounded increasingly worried during our conversations. Jason remained silent. Yet somehow, that silence felt different now. Not angry, not dismissive, almost ashamed. One evening, I received a letter from the insurance company confirming updates I had made months earlier. Emergency contacts, beneficiary information, administrative changes, ordinary paperwork. As I reviewed the documents, I remembered the day I removed Jason's name. At the time, the decision felt heartbreaking. Now it felt necessary. Not because I wanted distance, because I needed certainty. If someone tells you not to count on them, the responsible thing to do is listen. The following Saturday, I attended a gardening event in a neighboring town. The weather was beautiful, clear skies, cool air, the kind of day my husband would have loved. While walking through rows of flowering plants, I realized something important. For the first time in decades, I was making decisions entirely for myself. No waiting for family schedules. No checking whether someone might need me. No organizing my life around availability. The realization felt both liberating and sad, because I should have learned that lesson years earlier. When I returned home that evening, my answering machine light was blinking. One new message. My heart did not race the way it once would have. I pressed play calmly. For several seconds, all I heard was silence. Then Jason's voice filled the room. Mom, he stopped. Another silence followed. I do not know if you will call me back. His voice sounded tired. Older somehow. But I think I need to talk to you. I stood motionless in the middle of my kitchen. Months earlier, Jason told me not to count on him. Now, for the first time, he sounded like someone who no longer trusted himself. And deep down, I knew the call Hannah warned me about was getting closer with every passing day. 3 nights later, the call finally came. It was 1:57 in the morning when my phone rang. I woke instantly. At my age, phones rarely ring at that hour unless something is wrong. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen glowing in the darkness. Jason. My heart tightened immediately. Not because I was excited to hear from him. Because I already knew this call would be different from all the others that never came. I answered on the second ring. Jason. For several seconds, I heard nothing. Then a shaky breath. Mom. His voice sounded unlike anything I had ever heard before. Gone was the confidence. Gone was the certainty. Gone was the cold distance that filled the text message months earlier. What remained sounded tired. Frightened. Human. I sat up slowly in bed and switched on the lamp beside me. What happened? Another silence. Then he spoke. I need help. For simple words. Months earlier, he told me not to count on him. Now he was the one calling in the middle of the night asking for support. Yet strangely, I felt no satisfaction. No desire to remind him of what he had said. Only concern. Tell me what is going on, I said gently. Jason exhaled heavily. Everything fell apart. The phrase sounded familiar, like something he had repeated to himself over and over before finally saying it out loud. I listened quietly. Little by little, the story emerged. The investment Hannah mentioned had gone worse than I realized. Much worse. Money disappeared. Plans collapsed. People who promised support stopped answering calls. Several friends distanced themselves. Professional relationships evaporated almost overnight. I thought I was being smart, he admitted. I thought I was building something better for my family. His voice cracked slightly. Instead, I made things worse. I closed my eyes. Failure has a way of stripping away illusions. Where is Melissa? I asked. Sleeping. He hesitated. Or pretending to sleep. That answer told me plenty. And Hannah? At home. Another long silence followed. Then Jason said something that surprised me. I have been trying not to call you. I looked at the clock beside my bed. Nearly 2 in the morning. Why? His laugh sounded hollow. Because I remembered what I said. Neither of us needed to repeat the message. We both knew it by heart. Jason. My voice softened. You should have called sooner. The silence on the line lasted so long that I wondered if we had been disconnected. Then he finally answered. I was ashamed. There it was. The truth. Not pride. Not anger. Shame. Shame has a way of isolating people more effectively than any locked door ever could. I lost money, he continued. I lost opportunities. I lost people I thought were friends. His breathing grew uneven again. And the whole time, I kept thinking about that text. I stared into the soft light filling my bedroom. Why? Because every day it sounded worse. The honesty hurt more than I expected. Not because he regretted it. Because he finally understood it. "Mom," he said quietly, "I do not think I realized how cruel it was until I imagined Hannah saying those words to me someday." The room felt very still. Sometimes life teaches lessons through consequences that no lecture could ever provide. We talked for nearly an hour. Not about investments. Not about financial details. Not even about solutions. We talked about fear, expectations, pride, the pressure people place on themselves when they believe they must always appear strong. Finally, near the end of the conversation, Jason became quiet. "Mom." "Yes." His voice barely rose above a whisper. "I need you." The words hung between us. Months earlier, he insisted I should not count on him. Now he was reaching across the distance he created and admitting the exact opposite. I sat there holding the phone and thought about everything that happened since that message arrived. The hurt, the loneliness, the changes I made, the life I rebuilt. Then I looked around my quiet bedroom and realized something important. Helping him now did not require becoming the person I used to be. I could care about my son without surrendering myself again. "I know," I said gently. And for the first time in months, neither of us tried to pretend otherwise. The morning after that call, I expected to feel exhausted. Instead, I felt clear. Not happy, not relieved. Clear. For months, uncertainty had dominated everything. Why had Jason sent the message? Did he mean it? Would he ever reach out again? Now I knew the answers. He had meant it when he wrote it. He regretted it later. And life had finally forced him to confront the difference between independence and isolation. Around 10 o'clock, I received another call. This time it was not from Jason. It was from Hannah. The moment she heard my voice, she sighed with relief. "He called you, did he not?" I smiled softly. "Yes." "Good." The answer came so quickly that I laughed. "You sound happy about that." "Because he has been miserable for months." Her honesty startled me. "Miserable?" Hannah hesitated. "Grandma." Dad kept pretending everything was fine. I leaned back in my chair. "I know that habit." She laughed quietly. "Everybody knows that habit." Then her tone became serious. "The people he trusted disappeared." I listened carefully. Over the next few minutes, Hannah described things I never knew. Business contacts who stopped returning messages. Friends who suddenly became too busy. People who had once praised Jason's confidence, but vanished when he needed support. The more she spoke, the more one truth became obvious. The people Jason spent years trying to impress were nowhere to be found when life became difficult. Later that afternoon, Jason came to my house. He looked tired but different. Not defeated. Honest. We sat on the back porch overlooking the yard. Autumn leaves drifted across the grass. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then Jason surprised me. "Do you know what hurt the most?" he asked. "What?" He stared out at the trees. "Not losing money." I remained silent. "Not even losing opportunities." He shook his head. It was realizing how many relationships depended on success. The answer carried more weight than he probably realized. "People like being around confidence," I said quietly. "They do." He nodded. "Until confidence becomes vulnerability." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Jason laughed bitterly. "The funny thing is, the one relationship I pushed away was the only one that was never conditional." I looked down at my hands. The truth of that statement settled heavily between us. During the weeks after his message, I had spent countless hours wondering what I did wrong. The answer, it turned out, was nothing. This was never about me. It was about a man struggling with failure and mistaking distance for strength. As the afternoon passed, Jason began sharing details he had hidden from everyone. The failed investments, the mounting stress, the pressure he felt to appear successful for Melissa and the children, the fear that admitting weakness would make him seem inadequate. I thought if I solved everything alone, nobody would have to worry. He laughed softly. Instead, I made everything worse. I could not argue with that. Yet I also understood something he was only beginning to learn. Pride rarely protects people. It isolates them. Before leaving, Jason stood near the porch steps and looked back at me. "Mom." "Yes." "Do you know why I finally called?" I assumed I already knew. Desperation. Fear. Regret. Yet his answer surprised me. "Because Hannah asked me a question." My attention sharpened. "What question?" Jason smiled sadly. She asked who would still answer if I called at 2 in the morning. The words hit me harder than I expected. He looked away briefly, and I realized I only knew one person. After he left, I sat alone on the porch for a long time. The sun slowly disappeared behind the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A car passed. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life. Yet everything felt slightly different. For the first time since receiving that message, I stopped viewing the situation as a story about rejection. It was a story about revelation. Jason had spent years believing strength meant never needing anyone. Life had taught him otherwise. And sometimes those lessons arrive at a cost. As darkness settled across the yard, I thought about the message that started everything. The words still hurt. They probably always would. But now they no longer define the story. Because the story was not about what he said when he felt powerful. It was about what he learned when he finally realized he was not. Over the following month, something changed between Jason and me. Not overnight. Not dramatically. Trust rarely returns that way. Instead, it returned through small moments. A phone call asking how my day was. A visit that did not require a crisis as an excuse. A conversation that was not centered around problems. For the first time in years, our relationship felt less like an obligation and more like a choice. One Saturday afternoon, Jason invited me to lunch. We met at a small restaurant overlooking a lake outside town. The autumn colors reflected across the water, turning the surface gold and orange. For a while, we talked about ordinary things. Community events. Henna's school activities. Books I had been reading. Then Jason became quiet. I recognized that expression immediately. He was working up the courage to say something difficult. "Mom," he began, "there is something I need to tell you." I set down my coffee cup and waited. "Melissa and I have been talking a lot lately." I nodded. "About what happened?" "About everything." He stared out at the lake. "The investments. The pressure. The way I treated people." He shook his head. "Especially you." I remained silent. Sometimes people need room to hear themselves. For years, I thought putting my wife and children first meant everyone else came second. He laughed softly. "That sounds ridiculous now." The statement caught my attention. "Why?" Jason looked at me. "Because love is not a competition." The answer surprised me. Not because it was profound, because it was true. I spent years acting as though caring about you somehow threatened my commitment to my family. He looked down. Now I realized that was never the issue. We sat quietly for a moment. Then he added something I had not expected. "Melissa sees it now too." That evening, after I returned home, my phone rang. "Melissa." For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered. Her voice sounded nervous. "Eleanor." "Hello, Melissa." A brief silence followed. "I owe you an apology." The words came quickly, as though she had rehearsed them. For a long time, I encouraged Jason to think in extremes. She paused. "Family first. Everyone else second." I thought that was healthy. I listened without interrupting. What I did not understand is that pushing people away does not strengthen relationships. It weakens them. Her voice softened. "I am sorry for my part in that." The apology did not erase the past. Nothing could. Yet I appreciated something about it. It contained ownership instead of excuses. After we ended the call, I sat quietly in my living room. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Inside, I thought about how different everything felt compared to a few months earlier. Back then, I measured every day by what I had lost. Now I found myself paying attention to what I had gained. Independence, perspective, confidence, a life that belonged to me. The following weekend, Hannah invited me to attend an art exhibition at her school. As I walked through the displays, she proudly showed me painting after painting. Near the end of the exhibit, she stopped in front of one canvas and smiled. "This one is my favorite." The painting showed a large tree standing through different seasons. Spring, summer, autumn, winter. The same tree, changing but enduring. "What does it mean?" I asked. Hannah shrugged. "That some things stay important even when everything changes." I looked at the painting for a long time. Then I looked at my granddaughter. Sometimes wisdom arrives from unexpected places. Driving home that evening, I realized something important. The message Jason sent months earlier had felt like an ending. In reality, it forced all of us to confront things we had ignored for years. Pride, assumptions, fear, expectations. None of those conversations would have happened otherwise. The hurt was real. The damage was real. But so was the growth that followed. And as I pulled into my driveway beneath a sky filled with fading autumn light. I knew there was one final conversation still waiting to happen. Not about blame. Not about the past. About understanding what came next. Winter arrived quietly that year. The maple tree outside my kitchen window stood bare against a pale gray sky, and frost gathered along the edges of the garden every morning. Life felt calmer now. Not because every problem had disappeared, because everyone had finally stopped pretending. One Saturday afternoon, several months after that message changed everything, Jason invited the family to his house for an early holiday dinner. As I drove there, I found myself thinking about the previous year. The distance, the hurt, the certainty that my place in the family was disappearing. Back then, I believed the future would be defined by loss. I could not have been more wrong. When I arrived, Hannah opened the door before I had a chance to knock. "Grandma." She hugged me tightly and pulled me inside. The house smelled like cinnamon, roasted vegetables, and fresh bread. Laughter drifted from the kitchen. Melissa greeted me warmly. Jason appeared moments later carrying a serving tray. For a brief moment, I simply stood there taking everything in. Not because the evening was perfect, because it felt genuine. There is a difference. We gathered around the dining table shortly afterward. Conversations flowed naturally. No one seemed to be performing a role. No one appeared to be keeping score. Halfway through dinner, Jason set down his fork and looked around the room. "There is something I want to say." The table grew quiet. I noticed Hannah smile slightly. Apparently, she already knew this was coming. Jason looked directly at me. "This year taught me something important." He paused. "Actually, it taught me several things." A few people laughed softly. Then his expression became serious. "I spent years believing responsibility meant carrying everything alone." He shook his head. "I thought strength meant never needing help." The room remained silent. "What I finally learned is that real strength includes being honest when you are struggling." He looked down briefly before continuing. "And it includes appreciating the people who stay when you have nothing impressive left to offer." I felt my eyes sting unexpectedly. Not because of the words themselves, because I knew how difficult it was for him to say them. Jason had always been proud, sometimes too proud. Yet here he was, speaking openly in front of the people whose opinions once mattered so much to him. "Mom," he said softly, turning toward me. "I am sorry." No excuses followed. No explanations. Just those two words. Simple, direct, earned. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Nothing more needed to be said. Later that evening, after dinner ended and everyone moved into the living room, I found myself standing alone near the window watching snowflakes drift through the porch light. A few moments later, Jason joined me. For a while we simply watched the snow fall. "Do you remember that text?" he asked quietly. I smiled faintly. "I doubt I will ever forget it." He nodded. "Neither will I." The silence that followed felt comfortable rather than awkward. Finally, he spoke again. "The strange thing is, I thought I was protecting my family." I turned toward him. "From what?" "Failure." He laughed softly. "Turns out, the thing I was really protecting was my ego." The honesty made me smile. Growth often sounds a lot like humility. "You know," he continued, "when I sent that message, I thought I was establishing independence." He shook his head. What I was actually doing was pushing away one of the few people who loved me regardless of circumstances. Outside, the snow continued falling. Inside, the house glowed with warmth and conversation. I looked at my son and saw someone different from the man who sent those words months earlier. Not because life had become easier, because life had become real. Before I left that night, Hannah handed me a small wrapped gift. Inside was a framed photograph taken earlier that evening. The entire family stood together smiling. At the center of the picture was a handwritten note she had tucked behind the frame. It read, "Family is not who comes first. Family is who stays." I sat in my car afterward holding that photograph while snow settled softly across the windshield. The message Jason sent months ago had once felt like a prediction about the future. In reality, it became a lesson. Not about aging, not about dependence, about understanding the difference between being needed and being loved. One eventually changes with time. The other, when it is real, does not. As I drove home through the quiet winter night, my phone buzzed in the passenger seat. A new message from Jason appeared on the screen. Only 3 words. "Love you, Mom." This time, I smiled before the screen even finished lighting up. Because now I believed him.